Greetings, good people, and welcome back to Black Comic Characters. This is Donald E. Jones II, aka Solly Two Kings. My sincerest apologies for not putting out a video in some time, but first my computer's hard drive crashed, and then things just got a little busy for me. But now I have returned, and will not allow this much time to go between videos. It occurred to me that I have put out quite a few videos about the history of Black comic characters, but I have not done a video about my own history of collecting comics and how I started out. So, I would like to present the origin story of Solly Two Kings and Black comic characters. For those of you who know me, you know that I was born and raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to the best parents a boy could have. My mom, Joyce Jones, and my dad, who I am named after, Donald E. Jones Sr. I grew up in the 1980s and 90s. Growing up, I was always drawn to science fiction and fantasy, and I also had a knack for writing. I even had one of my monster profiles published in a citywide collection of elementary school children's writings when I was in the 4th grade. I was naturally drawn to Star Wars, as well as Transformers, He-Man, and Thundercats, all of which were huge hits in the 1980s. I was not into Star Trek because I was on the side of their rivals at the time. For those old enough to remember, the rivalry back then was not between Star Wars and Star Trek. No. It was between the Trekkies and the Whovians. Yes, there was a huge rivalry between Star Trek and Doctor Who back in the 1970s and 80s, and I am to this day, and always will be, a Whovian. I was watching Doctor Who long before it was cool, going back to the 4th Doctor, Tom Baker. So yes, my geekdom started very early. This led me to role-playing games in my middle school years. I didn't play Dungeons & Dragons. I first played Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the role-playing game by Palladium Books. I really liked their system, and then I started playing their flagship RPG, Rifts. Afterwards, I tried playing the Marvel Superheroes role-playing game because I was familiar with Spider-Man, the Incredible Hulk, and Captain America, as well as a few others from the popular cartoon and television shows. Now, I wasn't too crazy about the Marvel Superheroes role-playing game, but it did prompt me to ask my parents if I could get a few comic books to see if I liked them. I had always enjoyed reading, but I had not read comics before. So, my first intro to comics was Amazing Spider-Man. I don't exactly remember the issue, but I know that it was in the mid-200s at the time, and I was hooked. I really loved the character of Spider-Man, but what I really loved about the book were his villains. The Lizard, Doc Ock, Electro, Sandman, the Vulture, Scorpion, Kingpin. These were all great antagonists. I even loved his not-so-famous villains, the Kangaroo, Will-O-the-Wisp, Rocket Racer, Molten Man, the Gibbon. But one villain would always hold a special place in my heart for me. The Green Goblin. The dynamic between Spider-Man and the Green Goblin will always be the stuff of legend to me. I would soon branch out to collect the Fantastic Four and the X-Men, who I really liked until they started coming out with 20 different X titles, and then I lost interest. On a side note, Marvel seems to be doing that again in this current age, and I am still not a fan of it. I collected a few other less famous Marvel titles, such as Death's Head and Sleepwalker as well. Back then, Marvel was all I collected. I didn't collect DC. I guess I was kind of rivalry-minded and looked on DC as a rival. So, to me, the DC stories just really didn't appeal to me that much, and they just did not have enough good villains. Now, I loved the Joker, the Penguin, the Riddler, Catwoman, and Lex Luthor, but outside of those classic villains, DC did not garner my attention. So, for a long time, I said DC stood for dumb comics. Another reason that I was not crazy about DC is that I hardly saw any faces that looked like me. Even though I was young, I realized that there were more visibly black characters in Marvel than there were in DC. Because I collected Amazing Spider-Man, X-Men, and Fantastic Four, I would often see Joe Robbie Robinson, Storm, Luke Cage, Cloak, the Black Panther, the Prowler, and other black characters. Not to say that black comic characters were not in DC, but they certainly were not as visible in the 1980s. So I stuck with Marvel through the 80s and the 90s and collected steadily. By the way, back then, New Comic Book Day was on Friday, and the price of new comics were $1 to $1.25. The king-size comics and the annuals were about $2.50. Just to share some comic price perspective between then and now. Most of my collection came from my LCS at the time, the Phantom of the Attic, which was located at the now demolished Parkway Center Mall. Luckily, the owner, Ron Rusitano, and the Phantom are still around as he moved to a new location in Greentree after the mall closed. So I always go back there whenever I'm back in Pittsburgh. Another great comic store I went to is Eide's, located in downtown Pittsburgh, and has been in business for over 50 years. Absolutely fantastic shop with 2 floors of goodness. On a somber note, I would like to say rest in peace to the owner of Eide's who passed away last year, Greg Eide. He passed the ownership of Eide's to 2 longtime employees, Ken Kropf and Jim Taroxy, so Eide's is still going strong. So I am fortunate that my original LCSs are still around today. So if you're in the Pittsburgh area, you should check them both out. Around this time was also a time of self-discovery of my own history. Black history was not taught well in school. Well, let's be honest, it still isn't. But outside of the little black history that they did teach in school, I was woefully ignorant. One of my uncles, my Uncle Albert, gave me a book on African history called The Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization by Anthony Browder. This book introduced me to African civilizations and the great achievements that black people contributed to the world long before American enslavement. From this, my parents gave me other books and tape recordings of other black scholars who taught me my history. Cheikh Anta Diop, who proved multiple ways that the original ancient Egyptians who built the pyramids and taught Greece mathematics, philosophy, and medicine were not South Asian or Middle Eastern, but they were indeed black Africans. Asa Hilliard, who proved that Africans had a very strong presence in America long before Christopher Columbus was even born. There was Naim Akbar, a brilliant psychologist who speaks on the issues that American enslavement has on African Americans and European Americans today, and there are so many others. This is where my love of history, correct history, began. As the 90s wore on, I went to college at Bucknell University, located in the middle of Pennsylvania, and my collecting started to wane as I was focused on my studies. I graduated with dual degrees in theater and English, and afterwards moved to New York City to pursue theater. I had moderate success, but one of my key achievements was producing my own one-man show called Changes in Perspective that was off-Broadway. As I pursued theater, my collecting had stopped, for the moment. In the mid-2000s, I met the love of my life, Kathy, aka Solly Two Queens. We got married and started our family, moving down outside Atlanta, Georgia. Around this time, the MCU began churning out the hits like no one had seen before. When it began at first, I said to myself, why are they starting with Iron Man? As to me, Iron Man was well known, but he was a B-list character. He wasn't one of the big hitters like Spider-Man, X-Men, and Fantastic Four. But after I saw it, and the other movies that came out, I began to see their plan, and what a great plan it was that turned into the Avengers movie. Then we began to see the bigger plan with the small end-credit scenes with Thanos, and that eventually led up to the Infinity War and Endgame. This was a great time for all of us old comic collectors. Very quickly, comics were not uncool anymore. Comics had become mainstream. Any comic collectors from the 90s and prior can relate to this, but soon I became a huge source of information because I had collected comics for so long and knew many of the stories and the characters. So, back in 2016-2017, I began to slowly dive back into the waters of comic collecting. Now, I had missed a lot. The Civil War storyline, the death of Peter Parker, and the coming of Miles Morales, and the big onset of CGC and slabbing comics. My mind was in circles just trying to get caught up with everything. But luckily, when it comes to learning things, one can always depend on YouTube University. So, I began to look at a few videos on comics, when it did not take me long to find the great channel Reggie Collects. Reggie helped me understand what I had missed in comics because he too had a similar story of coming back into comics after a long hiatus, and his videos were well organized, fun, and he fostered a great community which still continues to this day. And a big shout out goes to the Gibbon Gang. So, I began to collect again. When I did pick up collecting again, my Marvel-only phase was left behind in the 90s, and I did actually branch out to DC, which turns out wasn't too bad. It seems like I had learned the error of my ways. I also started looking at some of the independent labels and fell in love with some of the stories from Boom Studios and Dark Horse. It wasn't long after this that I discovered OnyxCon here in Atlanta, a comic convention that focuses on and celebrates Black writers, creators, and artists. I found the experience mind-blowing because there was nothing like this growing up when I was little. It opened my eyes to how far things had come in comics to have a Black-themed comic convention. I soon came to know about other Black-themed conventions around the country and actual Black-owned comic shops as well, one being right here in Atlanta, called Challenges Games and Comics. All of this started to make me take a look at my own collection, and I realized that I did not have many comics that featured Black characters. So, I began to collect them. In collecting Black comics, I ended up using my love of history and began doing research on the history of these characters. I found out a lot of information. So, being inspired by Reggie's YouTube channel, I decided to do small character profiles on Instagram, and I called the segment Black Comic Characters. It received great response, and I even got a like and a very nice comment from Simone Missick, the actress who wonderfully portrayed Misty Knight in the Netflix Luke Cage series. So as I did more research and my Black comic character collection grew, I decided to start a YouTube channel where I could do a little more on the history of Black comic characters, speak on their current events, do some unboxings, showcase important comics in Black comic character history, and continue to do my Black comic character profiles. And that, my friends, is where we are today. And that is my origin story of how I got into comics and the origin story of Black comic characters. I really hope you enjoyed it. I also want to say thank you to everyone who has watched my videos, listened to my videos, and all of my subscribers. If you are new here, please hit the like button and subscribe. Also, leave a comment below so we can engage in conversation. I'd love to hear how you got into comics, because everyone loves a good origin story. Until the next time, peace and many blessings.